Hi, I'm Fed and I'm learning to make things by watching tons and tons of videos and pouring all that information through my eye holes and into my brain bucket. In today's video, I'll show you how I built a workbench around my table saw. It has an Outfeed table, a foldable extension, and lots of storage. Hi, I'm Fed. Ouch. When I started teaching myself woodworking, one of the first tools I bought was a small table saw. And I put it on top of a wobbly stand, which was my very first woodworking project, which I built with the table saw, which is pretty meta, right? It's pretty meta, right? I heard things. It's pretty meta. Well, I finally built myself an upgrade. If you're one of my 3 subscribers, you know I like to start my projects with a design. Well, check out my first design attempt at a table saw workbench. Pretty bleeping cool, right? But I couldn't get the permits for the flamethrowers. While building this project more than any other project I've done so far, I practiced iterative design. That's when you discover problems with your design and improve on it as you're building. So the more mistakes you make, the more opportunities to learn something and to improve on your design. And I'm so good at making mistakes, I'm a freaking genius. With some ideas I collected, stole, from other videos and some of my patented Da Vinci light squiggles in my little notebook, I came up with a second design in boring old Fusion 360. These are the main parts of my workbench. The frame, the benchtop itself with a cutout for the table saw, an adjustable shelf on top of which the table saw sits, a bottom shelf for storage, an extension table to make cutting wide pieces easier, and casters to make the whole thing movable. First step was breaking down the sheet goods. To know what to cut, I created a cut list with cutlistoptimizer.com. Next, I picked the least twisted and messed up 2x4s for the frame and cut them all to length. I had always planned to use trimmed 2x4s and pocket holes to build this workbench. As a practice project, I built another workbench and I really liked how it turned out, so I used the same technique here. The difficulty of cutting this 6-foot 2x4 on a little table saw is why I learned the term Outfeed table. It's an extension out of the front of a table saw which is really useful to support long pieces of material.
Look what I found. It's like a little tiny tree.
Then I drilled a bunch of pocket holes. Once I had my 2x4s ready, I started assembling the frame. Even though this is just a shop project, I did my best to make everything square and aligned. You might find that hard to believe as you watch my progress, but it's true. I put together the front and back frames and then attached them to each other with crossbeams. My workshop is really small, and I felt like I was playing Jenga with 2x4s. I selected the straightest 2x4s that I could, but most of the beams had curves and twists in them, so they didn't line up perfectly. Most of the misalignments weren't a big deal, but in some cases I had to plane surfaces to make them flush or force pieces into place. My design has the table saw sitting on a kind of shelf, supported on 2x4s attached to vertical beams that are part of the frame. Remember iterating? Well, I iterated the poop out of the table saw shelf. My original design was a single piece of plywood and some furniture levelers. And as soon as I started building it, I learned a hard lesson. Turns out you can design things on the computer that don't work in real life. I'll explain. I knew I wanted to use furniture leveler screws to make the shelf adjustable. That part worked. Well, it worked once I drilled the holes correctly. I figured out where the shelf supports should go and attached them. This is probably going to sound like bullshit, but I'm getting better at building stuff. I cut the table saw shelf to width, but not to an exact width because I didn't think it was a critical dimension, and that turned out to be kind of a mistake. When I test fit the shelf, it looked great. Isn't it pretty? See? But once I put the table saw on it, I saw how much it flexed and could move side to side. To keep the shelf from moving side to side, I cut some scrap pieces of wood from my previous wobbly table saw stand and attached them underneath the shelf. I had to iterate over where I placed the furniture levelers too. The rear ones were too far back and the shelf wasn't properly supported, so I moved them up. And for like the 4th time, I repositioned the table saw shelf supports. I tested the leveling of the shelf. It was better, but not great. The shelf no longer moved side to side, but it could move too far back. And the table saw itself moved all over the place. My first reaction was to add a mess of screws and bolts, but that didn't work. So I iterated. I cut some wooden blocks, drilled pocket holes into them, and almost ruined my pocket hole jig because I didn't set it up correctly. I sanded the back of the blocks into a nice curve. By the way, sanding to a pencil line like this is incredibly satisfying. Ah, so nice. Finally, I added some smaller blocks with divots in them so that the table saw would always end up in the same position. Now, finally, the table saw and the shelf it sat on were stable. Once the saw shelf was ready, I could attach the benchtop. From past projects, I learned that it's best to leave a wide margin around things like benchtops because you can always make final adjustments later. So that's what I did here. I screwed down the benchtop, cut off extra pieces, and flush cut the edges using a trim router bit. Oh, watch this! This is classic Fed. The router bit falls out of the router. I swear this has never happened to me before. And mark my words, it will never happen again. Take it nice and slow. Nice and slow. Sure, these flush trims look bad, but it's just a shop project. One of the hardest parts of this project was cutting out the opening for the table saw. First thing I did was move this cross piece to the center of the workbench, out of the way of where the table saw would go. Next, I made a template with a piece of paper, which I taped to the focus, damn it! Finally, thank you. The template was a little small because I wanted to sneak up on the measurements. I made the first cuts with a jigsaw, which turns out doesn't always cut straight. Before cutting out the table saw hole, I remembered that gravity exists and that if I didn't have supports in place, that piece of plywood would smash into my knees. See, I learned things. I temporarily placed a shelf so I could test the fit of the table saw. Nope, doesn't fit. But to be fair to me, I knew it would be a little small. My plan all along was to make rough cuts with the jigsaw and then use a router with a special bit to clean it up. This is a template router bit, which has a bearing on the top. To use it, you place a guide or template on top of what you're cutting, and the bearing runs along that guide. It's kind of like a reverse flush trim bit. I moved the guide around and snuck up to the correct size of the table saw hole. Okay, no lie, this was really scary. I think the router bit caught an edge and caused kickback, but if anyone knows better, let me know in the comments. And then this happened. Again. I know the kickback loosened the router bit, but still, so embarrassing. Once the sides were done, I cut out the channels for the table saw fence. These crappy cuts here are because my guides moved. And why did they move? Because I forgot to use double-sided tape. I've made that mistake several times in the past, but I won't make that mistake again. I also needed to cut out a slot on the side to allow the table saw fence to extend fully. And finally, I recut the sides of the table saw opening one last time after realizing they weren't parallel and the table saw was sitting at an angle. To make the workbench more sturdy and to provide more surface area for the casters, I attached these supports to the 6 legs. It's the same design I used for my other workbench project, which you can watch up here. As I mentioned, this workbench is based on my other workbench project. They use the same general construction techniques and dimensions, and that includes the same brand and size of casters, since I wanted both workbenches to be the same height. To attach the casters, I used the MVT, most valuable tool, from my hard drive cabinet video, the venerable hole punch. That was an exciting day in the workshop when the casters went on and I got to use my MVT. When I designed the bottom shelf, I was smart enough to add supports for the shelf, but not smart enough to add supports on the ends. See this? This part of the shelf is hanging in space. I did a dumb, but that gave me the opportunity to iterate, and iterate I did. I used some scrap pieces of wood from the old wobbly table saw stand and attached them to the ends, giving me a total of 5 supports under the bottom shelf. I trimmed one side of all the support 2x4s to make them square, and then used a scrap piece of plywood as a spacer to cut the supports so that the shelf would be flush with the workbench. So if I were to just cut this, this would be exactly 3 inches, but that's not what I want. I want it to be even smaller so that with this plywood, which is the bottom shelf, it'll be 3 inches. So I'm going to put this piece of plywood there. I'm going to press this 2x4 against that plywood and hold it down so it doesn't move. Slide this out, move over the fence, block it down, and now when I cut this piece with the shelf, it'll be exactly 3 inches. Oh, and I had to repair one of the supports because it looked like termites or something had eaten part of it. I just used a bunch of glue and screws. Seemed to work. I attached the supports using pocket holes, but I must have made a mistake. I mean a learning opportunity, because the screws poked out. But don't worry, I have a Dremel. I cut the bottom of the shelf to size, making some small adjustments because either the shelf or the frame itself wasn't square and it didn't quite fit. And then screwed it into place. When I did my YouTube workbench research, absorbing all those videos through my eye holes, I saw that there were tons of different ways that people were finishing their workbench work surfaces. I decided to cover the top of this workbench the same way I did my first workbench, which was using this hardboard stuff. I stole the idea from YouTube woodworker Steve Ramsey, and I really liked it. I thought it worked really well for that workbench. The idea is that hardboard is easily replaced if you damage it, if you get paint on it, or if you scuff it up in some way. Not that I would damage anything, because I'm good at stuff. But for this workbench with all its intricate cutouts, I don't think it made sense. It ended up being a lot of work, which I never want to repeat. I had to route out all the cutouts for the table saw. I had to cover the extension shelf separately. That said, I really liked how this chamfer on the extension shelf looks. with the contrast between the plywood and the hardboard, I think it looks really nice. Next thing I had to tackle were the miter slots, those useful tracks in the table saw that you can use for attachments such as miter gauges and table saw sleds. In order to prevent tools sitting in the miter slots from banging into the workbench top, my two choices were: 1. Raise the table saw well above the level of the workbench, or 2. Extend the miter slots through the workbench top. I opted for the second choice. I measured out where the slots should extend and confirmed that by eyeballing it. And then attached router guides with double-sided tape. I didn't get it right my first attempt. The slots were too narrow, so I did a second pass. That's why you can see these tape marks on the hardboard. And finally, we come to the extension shelf. This was one of the most important parts of this project for me. In the past, when my table saw sat atop that evil wobbly stand, cutting wide pieces of material involved a dangerous balancing act. Well, no more. I got the idea for the extension shelf from a guy on YouTube. His name is Bob, I think, and I hear he likes to make stuff. This is another area where I needed to iterate. See, my original design was flawed. I know, shocking. My mistake was not to take into account the thickness of the outer leg supports. The way I first had it caused the extension to rise above the top of the workbench, meaning it would always be in the way. To fix that, I had to fill the gap above the outer legs with a piece of plywood. And for that plywood to fit correctly, I had to trim the tops of the leg supports. This looks like a mess, I know. It's hard to trim end grain without pulling it out. I attached the strip and had to account for a curve in the plywood. Then I moved the shelf brackets to a new location. I'm not showing it here, but I ended up doing this 3 times because I made a lot of mistakes. I also had to add shims to get the extension shelf to line up. These surfaces had to be aligned or else the shelf would bind. And that rhymes, so you know it's true. And there you have it, my table saw workbench. Overall, I'm really happy with how it turned out. I'll leave you with the top 3 things I learned during this project. 1. Remember to use double-sided tape. It's great. 2. Be willing to adapt and iterate your designs as you discover that you've made a mistake, or 1,000 mistakes. 3. Router bits must be securely attached. Otherwise, they'll fall out mid-cut and you'll look like an idiot. Bye! Oh, I think I had the audio off this entire time. Cool.